Welcome to another spine-chilling night here on the channel. Before we dive into tonight's terrifying tale, I want you to do something for me. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let the sound of rain outside your window become part of the story we're about to tell, because what you're about to hear happened on a night just like this one, when the boundary between our world and something far more sinister became dangerously thin. My name is Sarah, and I've been investigating paranormal encounters for over 8 years now. I've walked through abandoned asylums, spent nights in supposedly haunted houses, and documented experiences that would make most people question their sanity. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened in the Blackwood Forest last October. Tonight, I'm going to share with you the most terrifying experience of my life. A night when rain-soaked whispers led me deeper into darkness than I ever imagined possible. This isn't just another ghost story or urban legend passed down through generations. This is my first-hand account of an encounter that changed everything I thought I knew about the supernatural. You see, the Blackwood Forest sits about 40 miles north of Salem, Massachusetts. It's a place where local residents have reported strange phenomena for over 2 centuries, missing hikers, unexplained lights, and voices that seem to call out from nowhere. The locals have a saying about Blackwood: when the rain falls and the mist rises, the forest remembers what it wants to forget. For months, I'd been receiving emails from people who claimed to have experienced something otherworldly in those woods. At first, I dismissed most of them as typical campfire stories or overactive imaginations. But then I started noticing patterns. Every single account mentioned the same 3 elements: heavy rainfall, whispered voices that seemed to know the listener's name, and an overwhelming compulsion to venture deeper into the forest despite every instinct screaming to turn back. The breaking point came when I received a video message from a local park ranger named Marcus Thompson. Marcus had worked those woods for 15 years, and he was as rational and level-headed as they come. But in that video, his hands were shaking, his voice barely above a whisper, and his eyes held a fear I'd never seen before in another human being. He told me about his patrol 3 nights earlier, during a torrential downpour that had flooded half the county. He'd been checking the main trails when he heard something that made his blood run cold. Voices, dozens of them, whispering his name from every direction, not shouting, not calling out for help, but whispering with an intimacy that suggested they knew him personally. Marcus described following the voices deeper into the forest, completely abandoning his planned route. He said it felt like being pulled by invisible strings, his feet moving without conscious direction. The whispers grew clearer as he walked, and he began to recognize some of the voices. His grandmother, who had died when he was 12. His high school friend who had been killed in a car accident. Even his own voice, whispering back to him from the darkness. What made Marcus's account different from all the others was what he found at the end of his journey. Deep in the heart of Blackwood Forest, in a clearing that shouldn't exist according to every map of the area, he discovered something that defied explanation. A perfect circle of dead trees, their branches twisted into impossible shapes, surrounding what appeared to be an old stone well. But here's where it gets truly unsettling. Marcus pulled out his phone to document what he was seeing, and in the brief illumination of his camera flash, he saw faces. Dozens of pale, translucent faces pressed against the inner walls of that well, all looking up at him with expressions of desperate hunger. The video Marcus sent me ended there, with him running through the forest, branches tearing at his clothes, the sound of whispers growing louder and more insistent with every step. He made it back to his truck, drove straight home, and called in sick for the next week. When he finally returned to work, he requested a transfer to a different district. That was 3 months ago, and he hasn't set foot in Blackwood Forest since. After watching that video 17 times, analyzing every frame, every word, every tremor in Marcus's voice, I knew I had to see this place for myself. I built my entire career on investigating the unexplained, and here was potentially the most significant paranormal location I'd ever encountered, just a few hours' drive from my home. But I wasn't going to walk into this blind. I spent weeks researching the history of Blackwood Forest, diving deep into local archives, old newspaper clippings and forgotten records that painted a picture far darker than I had imagined. The forest got its name from the Blackwood family, early settlers, who established a small community there in the late 1700s. According to historical records, the Blackwoods were a tight-knit clan of about 60 people who kept to themselves and rarely ventured into the nearby towns. They were known for their strange customs and whispered rumors of practices that made even the witch-fearing colonists uncomfortable. In the winter of 1794, something happened to the Blackwood settlement. The exact details are lost to history, but what we know comes from the journal of a traveling merchant named Ezra Holbrook. Holbrook had been making regular trips to trade with the Blackwoods for over 2 years, but when he arrived in February of 1794, he found the settlement completely abandoned. Not just empty, mind you, but abandoned in a way that suggested the residents had left in the middle of their daily activities. Meals still sat on tables, tools lay scattered where they'd been dropped, and children's toys were strewn about as if playtime had been interrupted by something urgent and terrifying. But the most disturbing detail in Holbrook's journal was his description of finding a newly constructed stone well in the center of the settlement. The well hadn't been there during his previous visit just 2 months earlier, yet it appeared ancient, as if it had been there for centuries. The stones were covered in symbols that Holbrook couldn't identify, and when he peered down into the darkness, he claimed to hear voices calling up to him. Holbrook's final entry about Blackwood was brief, but chilling. The voices know my name. They know things about me that no earthly being should know. I fear I have lingered too long in this cursed place. The rain has begun to fall, and the whispers grow stronger with each drop. I must leave now before it is too late. That was the last anyone heard from Ezra Holbrook. His wagon was found 3 days later on the main road, 20 miles from Blackwood, but Ezra himself was never seen again. The horses were still in their harnesses, calm and uninjured, but there was no sign of struggle, no indication of what had happened to their master. Over the following decades, the forest began to reclaim the Blackwood settlement. Trees grew through the floors of abandoned houses, vines covered the walls, and nature slowly erased almost every trace of human habitation. Almost every trace, except for one thing that seemed to resist the passage of time entirely: that mysterious stone well. Throughout the 1800s and into the early 1900s, there were sporadic reports of people encountering the well during hunting trips or while searching for lost livestock. Every account shared the same basic elements. The discovery happened during rainfall, the witnesses heard voices calling to them, and they felt an overwhelming compulsion to approach the well despite their better judgment. Some of these people made it home to tell their stories. Others, like Ezra Holbrook before them, simply vanished without a trace. By the 1920s, local authorities had designated Blackwood Forest as a restricted area, citing dangerous terrain and unstable ground conditions. But those of us who know the real history understand that the restrictions weren't about protecting people from falling into ravines or getting lost on unmarked trails. They were about protecting people from something far more sinister. The modern era brought new technology and new ways to document the unexplained phenomena in Blackwood Forest. Digital cameras, audio recording equipment, and GPS devices meant that investigators like myself could gather evidence that previous generations could only describe in handwritten journals and word-of-mouth accounts. But technology also brought new questions. Why did electronic devices malfunction so frequently in certain areas of the forest? Why did GPS units show impossible locations, placing users miles away from their actual position? And most disturbing of all, why did audio recordings from the forest sometimes capture voices that hadn't been audible to the human ear during the actual investigation? I'd studied dozens of these recordings, analyzing waveforms and frequency patterns, trying to find rational explanations for what appeared to be supernatural phenomena. Some of the voices were clear enough to make out individual words, while others were barely distinguishable from the ambient sounds of wind and rain. But they were there, undeniably present on the recordings, whispering names and speaking in languages that didn't match any known dialect. The most unsettling aspect of these voice recordings was their personal nature. They didn't speak in generalities or issue vague warnings. They addressed the listeners by name, referenced specific events from their past, and seemed to know intimate details about their lives that should have been impossible for any outside entity to access. This pattern of personal knowledge extended beyond just names and basic biographical information. The voices demonstrated awareness of private thoughts, secret fears, and hidden guilt that the listeners had never shared with another living soul. It was as if whatever force inhabited Blackwood Forest had the ability to peer directly into human consciousness and extract the most vulnerable aspects of a person's psyche. As I prepared for my own journey into Blackwood Forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to encounter something that would challenge everything I thought I understood about the nature of reality itself. The evidence was overwhelming, the historical documentation was extensive, and the modern accounts were too consistent to dismiss as mere coincidence or mass hysteria. But despite all my research, despite all the warnings embedded in centuries of documented encounters, I knew I had to go. The investigator in me, the part of my soul that had always been drawn to the unknown and unexplained, wouldn't allow me to walk away from what could be the discovery of a lifetime. Little did I know that my journey into those rain-soaked woods would become far more than just another paranormal investigation. It would become a fight for my very sanity, a test of everything I believed about the boundaries between the living and the dead, and ultimately a confrontation with forces that exist in the spaces between worlds. The night I chose for my investigation was October 13th, exactly 1 year after Marcus Thompson's terrifying encounter. The weather forecast called for heavy rain and dense fog, conditions that seemed to amplify whatever supernatural activity plagued the forest. I packed my equipment carefully, multiple cameras with night vision capability, high-quality audio recording devices, extra batteries, emergency supplies, and most importantly, a detailed map showing the approximate location where Marcus had discovered the mysterious well. As I loaded my gear into the truck that evening, rain was already beginning to fall. The drive to Blackwood Forest took exactly 2 hours and 37 minutes through winding back roads that seemed to grow narrower with each passing mile. The rain had intensified from a gentle drizzle to a steady downpour, and by the time I reached the forest access road, my windshield wipers could barely keep up with the deluge. I parked my truck at the same spot where Marcus had left his vehicle a year earlier, a small gravel pullout about half a mile from the main trail entrance. The moment I stepped out of the cab, I felt it. That indescribable sensation that every paranormal investigator learns to recognize, the feeling that you're being watched by something that shouldn't exist. The rain was cold against my face, each drop feeling heavier than it should, as if the very atmosphere of this place was somehow denser than the world I'd left behind. I pulled on my rain gear, checked my equipment one final time, and started the trek toward the forest entrance. The main trail was well maintained, with clear markers every quarter mile, and reflective signs warning hikers to stay on designated paths. But as I walked deeper into the woods, following the route Marcus had described in his video, those official markers became fewer and farther between. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches reaching across the path like gnarled fingers trying to block my passage. It was at the 3rd mile marker that I heard it for the first time. Just the faintest whisper, so quiet I almost convinced myself it was the sound of rain hitting leaves, but then it came again, clearer this time, and my blood went cold. Sarah. My own name, spoken with perfect clarity through the darkness ahead. I stopped walking and stood perfectly still, listening for any other sound that might explain what I'd heard. A bird call, maybe, or the wind creating an audio illusion. But the forest had gone completely silent, except for the steady rhythm of rainfall. I pulled out my digital recorder and checked the audio levels. Everything was working perfectly, the device picking up the ambient sounds of rain and my own breathing with crystal clarity. I pressed record and continued down the trail, documenting every step of my journey. My name is Sarah, I spoke into the recorder, and it's currently 9:47 p.m. on October 13th. I'm approximately 3 miles into Blackwood Forest, following the main trail toward the location described by Ranger Thompson. Weather conditions are exactly as expected, heavy rain with limited visibility. As I finished my status update, the whisper came again, but this time it wasn't just my name. Sarah, we've been waiting. The voice was soft, almost gentle, with an accent I couldn't place. It sounded like an elderly woman, someone who might have been a beloved grandmother or favorite teacher. There was nothing threatening about the tone, which somehow made it infinitely more unsettling than if it had been obviously malevolent. I checked my recorder to make sure it was still functioning, then continued forward. The trail began to slope downward, and I realized I was descending into a valley that didn't appear on any of the maps I'd studied. The trees here were different too, older and more twisted, their bark so dark it seemed to absorb what little light filtered through the canopy. Every few minutes, another whisper would drift through the rain. Sometimes it was my name, other times fragments of sentences that seemed designed to draw me deeper into the forest. Don't be afraid, Sarah. We have so much to show you. The others didn't understand, but you will. Each voice was distinct, different ages and genders, but all sharing that same unnaturally intimate tone. They spoke as if they knew me personally, as if we were old friends having a casual conversation, rather than disembodied entities communicating across impossible barriers. The most disturbing aspect was how the voices seemed to respond to my thoughts. When I wondered if I should turn back, a voice immediately whispered, "Not yet, you're so close." When I questioned whether my equipment was working properly, another voice assured me, "Everything is exactly as it should be." By 10:30, I had traveled what felt like miles beyond where any official trail should have led. My GPS unit had stopped providing accurate readings an hour earlier, showing my position as fluctuating wildly between coordinates that placed me everywhere from the middle of a lake to the center of a nearby town. The compass on my phone spun continuously, unable to find magnetic north, but the voices grew stronger and more numerous with each step. What had started as occasional whispers had evolved into a constant murmur of conversation, as if I were walking through an invisible crowd of people, all eager to share their thoughts. I could make out individual words now, complete sentences, and the content was becoming increasingly personal. Remember when you were 7, Sarah, and you found that injured bird in your backyard? You still blame yourself for what happened to your sister, don't you? The nightmares never really stopped, did they? These weren't random statements or lucky guesses. The voices were referencing specific memories, traumatic events from my childhood that I'd never discussed with anyone, fears and regrets that I'd buried so deep I'd almost forgotten them myself. It was as if whatever intelligence controlled these voices had complete access to my most private thoughts and experiences. I forced myself to keep recording, to maintain some semblance of scientific objectivity despite the growing terror that threatened to overwhelm my rational mind. This was exactly the kind of evidence I'd spent years searching for, proof of supernatural intelligence that defied every natural law I understood. The voices are demonstrating knowledge of personal information. I spoke into the recorder, trying to keep my voice steady. Details that should be impossible for any external entity to possess. The phenomenon appears to be intensifying as I move deeper into the forest. As if responding to my clinical analysis, the whispers suddenly stopped. The forest fell into an unnatural silence that was somehow more frightening than the constant murmur of voices had been. Even the rain seemed to quiet, though I could still feel drops hitting my jacket and the ground beneath my feet. I stood motionless for several minutes, straining to hear any sound that might indicate what had changed. Then, gradually, a new noise began to emerge from the silence. Not voices this time, but something that sounded like distant music. A melody that seemed hauntingly familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have heard it before. The music was beautiful in a melancholy way, like a lullaby played on instruments I couldn't identify. It seemed to come from directly ahead, deeper in the forest where the trail disappeared into a wall of twisted trees and hanging moss. Without conscious decision, I found myself walking toward the source of the melody. This was the compulsion that every witness had described, the irresistible urge to abandon caution and venture into areas where rational thought warned against going. I understood now why Marcus had left his designated patrol route, why Ezra Holbrook had lingered too long in the abandoned settlement, why dozens of people over the centuries had simply vanished into these woods. The music wasn't just beautiful, it was seductive in a way that bypassed logical thought and appealed directly to some deeper part of human consciousness. It promised answers to questions I'd carried my entire life, resolution to conflicts that had shaped my identity, and peace for wounds that had never properly healed. As I pushed through the undergrowth, following the melody deeper into unmarked territory, the trees began to change around me. The bark grew paler, almost white in places, and the branches took on increasingly unnatural shapes. Some twisted into spirals that hurt to look at directly, while others formed patterns that resembled symbols or letters in an alphabet I'd never seen before. The ground beneath my feet felt different too, softer somehow, as if I were walking on something organic rather than earth and fallen leaves. When I stopped to examine the surface with my flashlight, I discovered a carpet of pale, mushroom-like growths that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. The music grew louder and more complex, adding layers of harmony that suggested multiple performers despite the impossibility of any orchestra existing in this remote location. I could distinguish individual instruments now, strings that sang with inhuman beauty, percussion that matched the rhythm of my own heartbeat, and wind instruments that seemed to breathe with a life of their own. By 11:15, I had traveled so far from any known trail that my flashlight beam revealed landscape that shouldn't exist in Massachusetts. The trees here were enormous, their trunks easily 20 feet in diameter, rising to heights that disappeared into the rainy darkness above. Moss hung in thick curtains from every branch, creating a cathedral-like space that felt both sacred and profoundly wrong. And then I saw it. Just as Marcus had described, a perfect clearing opened before me, illuminated by a pale light that had no visible source. The dead trees formed an exact circle around the perimeter, their branches twisted into shapes that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them directly. In the center of the clearing stood the stone well. It was smaller than I'd expected, perhaps 4 feet in diameter, constructed from blocks of dark stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The symbols carved into its surface were unlike anything in my extensive knowledge of historical markings. They seemed to shift and flow when viewed peripherally, as if the stone itself was alive and constantly reshaping the patterns etched into its surface. The music had stopped the moment I entered the clearing, replaced by a sound that was somehow worse than any supernatural voice or impossible melody. It was the sound of breathing, deep and rhythmic, coming from within the well. Not human breathing, but something that suggested massive lungs drawing air with deliberate, measured breaths. I approached the well slowly, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run back the way I'd come. But the investigator in me, the part that had driven me to spend years documenting the impossible, compelled me to continue forward. This was why I'd come to Blackwood Forest, why I'd spent months researching and preparing for this moment. I needed to see what lay at the bottom of that ancient stone structure. The rain continued to fall around the clearing, but somehow none of it seemed to enter the space where I stood. The drops simply stopped in mid-air at the tree line, as if hitting an invisible barrier that protected the well and everything surrounding it. The effect created a dome of silence and stillness that felt completely separate from the natural world I'd left behind. As I reached the edge of the well, the breathing sound grew louder and more pronounced. I could feel warm air rising from the depths, carrying with it a smell that reminded me of old libraries and forgotten attics, places where time had accumulated like dust on neglected shelves. I pulled out my most powerful flashlight and directed its beam down into the darkness. What I saw in those depths will haunt me for the rest of my life. The well wasn't filled with water as I'd expected, but with something that looked like liquid starlight, a substance that seemed to contain its own illumination while simultaneously absorbing any light I directed toward it. The surface rippled constantly despite the absence of any wind or disturbance, creating patterns that suggested movement far below. But it wasn't the strange liquid that made me stumble backward from the well's edge. It was the faces, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, pressed against the inner walls of the well shaft, pale, translucent features that seemed to exist both within the stone and floating just beneath the surface of that impossible liquid. Men, women, children, all looking upward with expressions of desperate longing and terrible hunger. Some of the faces I recognized from old photographs I'd discovered during my research. Ezra Holbrook, the merchant who had vanished in 1794, his features exactly as they appeared in a portrait painted before his final journey. Members of the Blackwood family, their faces matching descriptions from historical records. And others, dozens of others, people who had disappeared over the centuries, all trapped within the walls of this ancient well. But the most horrifying recognition came when I saw a face near the top of the shaft, just a few feet below the surface. Marcus Thompson, the park ranger whose video had brought me to this cursed place, stared up at me with eyes that held both recognition and warning. Marcus had never made it home from Blackwood Forest. The man who had sent me that terrified video message, who had requested a transfer to another district, who had been too frightened to return to these woods, was trapped within the well along with all the others who had answered its call over the centuries. The breathing sound intensified, and I realized it wasn't coming from the well itself, but from the faces within it. All of them breathing in unison, their mouths opening and closing with that same measured rhythm I'd been hearing since entering the clearing. And then, with perfect synchronization, They began to whisper my name. Sarah. Sarah. Sarah ... The sound rose from the well like a chorus of the damned, each voice perfectly synchronized yet maintaining its own distinct character. The faces within the stone walls moved their lips in perfect unison, creating a whispered symphony that seemed to resonate through my bones rather than simply entering through my ears. I stumbled backward, my equipment bag hitting the ground with a dull thud that seemed impossibly loud in the supernatural stillness of the clearing. But even as terror flooded my system, the investigator in me recognized what I was witnessing. This wasn't just some random haunting or residual energy from past tragedies. This was something far more organized, far more intelligent, and infinitely more dangerous. The liquid within the well began to churn more violently, and the pale illumination it emitted grew brighter. In that increasing light, I could see details that made my rational mind struggle to process what my eyes were recording. The faces weren't simply pressed against the stone walls, they were emerging from them, pushing through the rock as if it were nothing more than thick water. Marcus Thompson's face broke the surface first, his features distorted by whatever impossible physics governed this place. His mouth opened and closed, not in the rhythmic breathing pattern of the others, but as if he were trying to speak words that wouldn't form. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that conveyed desperate urgency. "Run," he finally managed to whisper, the word barely audible above the chorus of voices calling my name. "Don't listen! Don't look down! Just..." But even as Marcus struggled to warn me, I felt that same compulsion that had drawn him and countless others to this cursed place. The voices weren't just calling my name anymore. They were weaving stories, sharing memories, offering answers to questions I'd carried my entire life. "Your sister's accident wasn't your fault, Sarah," whispered a voice that sounded exactly like my grandmother, dead now for 15 years. "You were only 12. There was nothing you could have done." "The investigation that ended your marriage," added another voice, this one matching my ex-husband's tone perfectly. "You chose your work over our relationship because you were searching for something. We can show you what that something is." "Every nightmare you've had since childhood," came a third voice, high and sweet like a child singing a lullaby. "They were glimpses of this place. We've been calling you home for so long." The most terrifying aspect wasn't the supernatural nature of what was happening, but how right the voices sounded. Every word they spoke resonated with truths I'd never shared with another living soul. They knew about the guilt I carried over my sister's drowning, the way I'd blamed myself for not being there to save her. They understood the obsession that had driven me to investigate the paranormal, the desperate need to find evidence that some part of human consciousness survived death. They knew because they had been watching me my entire life, waiting for the night when I would finally answer their call. I forced myself to step backward, away from the well's edge, but my feet felt like they were moving through thick mud. The air itself seemed to resist my retreat, growing denser with each step I tried to take. The faces within the well grew more animated, their whispered pleas becoming more desperate and insistent. "Don't leave us, Sarah," called a voice that could have been my own mother. "We've been so lonely, waiting so long for someone who could understand." "You've spent your whole life looking for proof," added Marcus Thompson's distorted whisper. "Here it is. Here's everything you've ever wanted to know about what comes after death." "Just one look," pleaded the child's voice. "One look into the depths, and you'll understand everything. The purpose behind every loss, every tragedy, every moment of suffering you've endured." My hand trembled as I reached for my digital recorder, still running despite everything that had happened. I needed to document this, to capture evidence of what I was experiencing, even as every survival instinct screamed at me to drop my equipment and run. The entities are demonstrating advanced psychological manipulation, I whispered into the device, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. They're accessing personal information and using emotional trauma as a lure. The compulsion to approach the well is increasing despite conscious resistance. But even as I spoke these clinical observations, I found myself taking another step forward. The liquid light within the well pulsed brighter, and new faces began to emerge from the depths. People I didn't recognize but somehow felt I should know, their features bearing resemblances to family members, childhood friends, and colleagues who had shaped my life in significant ways. One face in particular drew my attention, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a gentle smile that seemed familiar despite my certainty that I'd never met her before. She rose closer to the surface than the others, her form more solid, more present in this impossible space. "I'm your great-grandmother, Sarah," she said, her voice carrying the warmth of summer afternoons and childhood comfort. "Eleanor Blackwood. Yes, that Blackwood. Our family built this place, tended it, protected it for generations before the others came and drove us away." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I'd never known my great-grandmother's maiden name, never researched that branch of my family tree. But somehow, looking at this woman's face, I could see the resemblance, the shared features that connected us across generations. "This well isn't a prison, dear one," Eleanor continued, her translucent hand reaching upward, as if she could somehow touch my face from within the stone depths. "It's a doorway, a threshold between worlds that allows us to exist in both realms simultaneously. We're not trapped here, we're waiting here, waiting for family to come home." "That's impossible," I said aloud, though my voice lacked conviction. "The historical records show the Blackwood family disappeared. They were settlers, not supernatural entities." Eleanor's smile grew sad, tinged with the weight of centuries. "We were settlers first, yes. But this land was already occupied when we arrived. The indigenous people who lived here before us knew about the threshold, respected it, maintained the balance between worlds. We thought we could do the same, but we lacked their wisdom." Other voices joined hers, creating a narrative that wove through the rain-soaked air like smoke from a dying fire. The story they told challenged everything I thought I knew about Blackwood Forest and my own family history. "We tried to use the threshold for our own purposes," admitted a voice that sounded like an older man, perhaps Eleanor's husband. "We thought we could communicate with the dead, gain knowledge from those who had passed beyond the veil. But the threshold demanded payment for such access." "One life for each question answered," whispered another voice, this one barely more than a breath. "One soul for each secret revealed." We thought we were so clever, so much more advanced than the people who had come before us. "But the threshold was hungry," Eleanor continued, her face now pressed against the inner surface of the well, as if she were looking through a window. "It had been maintained by careful ritual and respectful distance for thousands of years. Our attempts to exploit it upset that balance, and it began to take more than we had agreed to. Give." The liquid within the well swirled faster, creating a vortex that seemed to draw not just light, but reality itself into its depths. The faces moved with the current, spinning around the perimeter of the shaft while maintaining their upward gaze. "The night we all disappeared," Eleanor said, her voice growing fainter as the vortex pulled her deeper. "We made one final attempt to close the threshold, to seal it permanently and protect future generations from our mistakes. But the ritual required all of us to enter the space between worlds, to become guardians rather than exploiters. "We've been here ever since," added Marcus Thompson's voice, somehow cutting through the supernatural chorus. "Everyone who gets drawn to this place, everyone who hears the whispers in the rain, they all have some connection to the original families. Bloodline, marriage, adoption, it doesn't matter. The threshold recognizes its own." I felt my knees buckle as the full implications of their words sank in. This wasn't random supernatural activity or some cosmic accident. The well, the voices, the compulsion that had drawn me through miles of impossible forest terrain, it was all part of a system that had been operating for centuries, a system that identified and collected specific individuals based on genealogical connections I'd never known existed. "But there's still a choice," Eleanor said, her voice now coming from much deeper within the well. "The threshold offers two paths. Join us willingly and retain your consciousness, your memories, your ability to help guide others who will inevitably follow, or fight the call until it takes you anyway and lose yourself completely to the hunger that maintains this place." The rain began to fall more heavily around the clearing's perimeter, though still none of it entered the protected space where I stood. But I could hear it drumming against the invisible barrier, creating a rhythm that matched the breathing of the faces within the well. "How long do I have to decide?" I asked, surprised by the calmness in my own voice. The terror was still there, coursing through my veins like ice water, but it was joined now by something else. Curiosity. The same driving need to understand that had shaped my entire career. "Time works differently here," Eleanor replied. "But in the world you came from, dawn will break in approximately 4 hours. When the sun rises over Blackwood Forest, the threshold will close until the next time conditions are right. The next time the rain falls and the mist rises, and someone with the proper bloodline hears our call." "What happens if I leave now?" I pressed. "If I walk away and never come back?" The silence that followed my question was more unsettling than any of the supernatural voices had been. Finally, Marcus Thompson answered, his words heavy with regret. "You can't leave, Sarah. Not really. The threshold has acknowledged you now, recognized your connection to this place. You'll carry it with you, wherever you go. The whispers will follow you home, grow stronger during the storms, call to you in your dreams. And eventually, probably within a year, you'll find yourself back here, whether you want to be or not." "Others have tried to resist," added another voice, this one unfamiliar, but carrying the weight of experience. "They've moved across the country, changed their names, surrounded themselves with people who claimed they could protect them from supernatural forces, but the threshold is patient. It can wait decades if necessary." "The only question," Eleanor said, her face now barely visible in the swirling depth, "is whether you'll come back as yourself or as something the hunger has already begun to consume." I looked around the clearing, taking in the twisted trees, the impossible stillness, the pale light that illuminated everything without casting shadows. My scientific mind catalogued every detail, storing observations that would mean nothing if I didn't survive to share them with the world. But another part of me, the part that had always felt slightly disconnected from normal human experience, recognized something profound in this place. The sense of belonging I'd never found in ordinary life, the answers to questions I'd been asking since childhood, the family connections I'd never known existed. "If I choose to stay willingly," I said slowly, "what exactly does that mean? What would my existence be like?" Eleanor's face brightened, rising closer to the surface of the impossible liquid. You would become a guardian of the threshold, helping to maintain the balance between worlds. You would retain your consciousness, your memories, your ability to think and feel and experience. But you would also gain access to knowledge that spans centuries, understanding that transcends the limitations of a single human lifetime. You could help others who are drawn here, Marcus added, guide them through the choice, help them understand what they're facing. Some will choose to join us, others will need to be protected from the hunger that feeds on unwilling souls. And you would see your sister again? Whispered a voice so soft I almost missed it. All the people you've lost, all the connections that were severed by death, they exist here in the space between worlds. Not as they were in life, but as they truly are beneath the surface of physical existence. The promise hit me harder than any of their other revelations. My sister Jenny drowned at age 8 while I was supposed to be watching her. The guilt that had shaped my entire life, driving me to search for evidence that consciousness survived death, that somewhere in the universe her spirit continued to exist. Jenny's here? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. She's been waiting for you, Eleanor confirmed. Just as we all have. The threshold doesn't separate families, Sarah. It reunites them across the boundaries that death creates in the physical world. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the seductive pull of their promises. But even with my vision eliminated, I could feel the presence of the well, the gentle tug that drew me toward its edge like gravity pulling water downhill. When I opened my eyes again, the scene had changed. The faces within the well had multiplied, filling every inch of the stone walls with translucent features that looked up at me with expressions of hope and longing. And there, near the surface, easily recognizable despite the years that had passed since her death, was Jenny. She looked exactly as she had at age 8, her blonde hair floating around her face like she was suspended in water, her blue eyes bright with the intelligence and curiosity that had made her such a joy to be around. But there was something more now, a depth of understanding that spoke of experiences beyond what any 8-year-old should possess. "Sarah," she said, her voice carrying all the warmth and love I remembered from our childhood. "I've missed you so much. I've been watching over you, trying to protect you from the nightmares, but I could never reach you in the physical world." "Jenny," I whispered, falling to my knees at the edge of the well. "I'm so sorry. I should have been watching you more carefully. I should have been there when you fell into the lake." "It wasn't your fault," Jenny said, her small hand pressing against the inner wall of the well, as if she could somehow touch my face. "It was never your fault. I chose to enter the water that day because I could hear the voices calling, the same voices that brought you here tonight. Our family has always been connected to places like this, thresholds between worlds." "But you were just a child," I protested. "You couldn't have understood what you were choosing." Jenny's expression grew sad, but also infinitely wise. "Age works differently in the space between worlds, Sarah. I've had 30 years to grow and learn and understand what happened. I've become something more than I could have been if I'd lived a normal human life." The implications of her words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the rain-soaked forest around us. Jenny hadn't just died in that lake 30 years ago. She'd been drawn there by the same supernatural forces that had brought me to Blackwood Forest. Our family's connection to the threshold went back further than Eleanor's generation, possibly spanning centuries of similar encounters. "How many of us have there been?" I asked. "How many members of our family have answered these calls over the years?" "Dozens," Eleanor replied. The bloodline carries a sensitivity to the places where reality grows thin. We're drawn to haunted locations, supernatural phenomena, unexplained mysteries. Most of us become investigators or researchers or writers, spending our lives documenting the impossible. But eventually we all find our way to a threshold, added another voice, this one belonging to a man who might have been my great-grandfather. Some resist longer than others, but the call is always stronger than our ability to ignore it. The choice you're facing tonight, Jenny said, her young voice carrying the weight of decades, is the same choice every generation has faced. Embrace what we are and join the family that exists beyond death, or fight against our nature until the threshold claims us anyway. I looked around the clearing one more time, taking in the impossible geometry of the twisted trees, the pale light that had no source, the rain that fell everywhere except where I stood. This place existed outside the normal laws of physics, a pocket of reality where consciousness could persist beyond the death of the physical body. Everything I'd spent my career searching for was here, waiting for me to make a choice that would determine not just my fate, but my understanding of what it meant to be human in a universe far stranger and more complex than most people could imagine. The voices within the well continued their gentle chorus, sharing stories of lives lived and deaths transcended, painting a picture of existence that extended far beyond the brief span of mortal years. And through it all, Jenny's face remained focused on mine, radiating the love and acceptance I'd spent 30 years trying to find in the world of the living. Dawn was still hours away, but I could feel time moving differently in this place, flowing like the liquid light within the well, carrying me toward a decision that would echo through generations yet to come. The rain continued to fall beyond the clearing's invisible boundary, and somewhere in its rhythm, I thought I could hear new voices beginning to whisper, calling to others who carried the bloodline, who would someday find their way to this same impossible choice. The threshold was patient, but it was also hungry, and it would continue to call until every member of our extended family had answered. The question was whether I would answer as a willing participant or as prey to something that had been feeding on human consciousness for far longer than recorded history could account for. I reached into my equipment bag and pulled out my phone, checking the time despite knowing that normal measurements had little meaning in this place. But I needed some connection to the rational world I'd left behind, some anchor to the life and identity I was being asked to abandon. 2:37 a.m. Less than 4 hours until dawn, until the threshold would close and release me back into a world that would never make sense again. 4 hours to make a decision that would determine the nature of my existence for whatever passed as eternity in the space between worlds. The faces within the well watched me with patient expectation, their whispered voices weaving through the supernatural stillness like threads in a tapestry that stretched across centuries. And at the center of it all, Jenny waited with the smile I remembered from childhood, offering me the reunion I'd dreamed of since the day she died. But even as every emotional impulse urged me toward the well's edge, toward the family that promised to make me whole again, the investigator in me recognized that I was being manipulated by forces I didn't fully understand. The threshold might be offering truth, but it was truth that came with a price that couldn't be calculated in any currency I understood. The rain drummed harder against the invisible barrier, and in its rhythm I heard something that made my decision even more complex. New voices, faint but growing stronger, calling out names I didn't recognize but somehow felt I should know. Others were coming to Blackwood Forest, drawn by the same compulsion that had brought me here, and when they arrived, they would face the same impossible choice, guided by whatever decision I made in the next few hours. The weight of that realization crashed over me like a physical force. This wasn't just about my choice anymore. Whatever I decided in this cursed clearing would establish a precedent, create a template that would influence how future visitors experience their encounter with the threshold. If I chose to join willingly, would that make it easier for the entities to manipulate others? If I resisted and was taken anyway, would that demonstrate the futility of fighting against forces beyond human comprehension? "You're thinking like an investigator again," Jenny observed, her young face showing understanding far beyond her apparent years. "Always trying to protect others, always carrying responsibility that isn't yours to bear." "But it is my responsibility," I replied, surprised by the conviction in my voice. "I came here because I wanted answers, but I also came because people have been disappearing. Marcus Thompson, Ezra Holbrook, dozens of others over the centuries. If there's a way to break this cycle, to warn people away from this place, then I have an obligation to find it." The faces within the well-exchanged glances, a ripple of communication passing between them that I couldn't fully interpret. Eleanor rose closer to the surface, her expression growing more serious. "You think you can save people from their nature," she said, not unkindly. "But the threshold doesn't create the sensitivity that draws us here, Sarah. It simply recognizes what already exists. We are what we are, because of something deeper than choice, something written into the very fabric of our genetic code." "That sounds like predestination," I countered, "like we never had free will to begin with." "Not predestination," corrected a voice I hadn't heard before, belonging to a woman who appeared to be in her 40s with intelligent eyes and prematurely grey hair. "Probability. Think of it as a statistical likelihood rather than an inevitable fate. Some bloodlines are more sensitive to supernatural phenomena than others. Some individuals within those bloodlines are more receptive than their siblings or cousins." She paused, studying my face with scientific interest. I was a mathematician before I answered the call, spent 20 years calculating probabilities and analyzing patterns. What I learned here is that consciousness itself operates according to rules we barely understand. The threshold isn't some malevolent entity feeding on human souls. It's more like a natural phenomenon that exists at the intersection of multiple dimensions. "Dr. Patricia Hawthorne," she continued, introducing herself with the same professional courtesy she might have used at an academic conference. "I disappeared from MIT in 1993 while researching quantum consciousness. My colleagues assumed I'd suffered a mental breakdown, abandoned my research to join some New Age commune. They had no idea I'd found proof that consciousness exists independently of brain function." Her revelation added another layer to the complexity of what I was facing. These weren't just random victims of supernatural predation. They were individuals who had been drawn to investigate the unexplained long before encountering the threshold. Scientists, researchers, investigators like myself, all following paths that led inevitably to this moment of choice. "How many of us are still out there?" I asked. "How many people with the sensitivity conducting investigations, moving closer to their own encounters?" "Thousands," Dr. Hawthorne replied matter-of-factly. "The internet has made it easier for people to research paranormal phenomena, to connect with others who share their experiences. But it's also made it easier for the thresholds to identify potential candidates." "Thresholds," I repeated, catching her use of the plural. "There are others?" "Dozens that we know of," Eleanor confirmed. "Ancient places where the barriers between dimensions have worn thin over centuries of use. Stone circles, burial mounds, natural caves, abandoned settlements like our original Blackwood community. Each one maintains its own ecosystem of consciousness, its own community of guardians." The scope of what they were describing overwhelmed my ability to process it rationally. I'd spent years investigating individual cases of paranormal activity, treating each haunting or supernatural encounter as an isolated phenomenon. But they were describing a vast network of interdimensional crossing points, each one populated by the consciousness of people who had made the same choice I was now facing. The modern world has forgotten that these places exist, added Marcus Thompson, his face now clearer, as he floated near the surface of the impossible liquid. But the sensitivity remains in certain bloodlines, drawing us to investigate what others dismiss as folklore or superstition. We're not victims, Sarah. We're explorers who found something extraordinary and chosen to study it from the inside. But what about the people who resist? I pressed. What happens to those who try to walk away? The silence that followed my question was heavy with implications. Finally, Jenny spoke, her child's voice carrying adult sadness. The hunger feeds on unwillingness, she said simply. Consciousness that fights against the threshold's pull becomes distorted, twisted into something that serves the dimensional interface without retaining individual identity. They become part of the mechanism rather than part of the community. Like antibodies in an immune system, Dr. Hawthorne added. Consciousness that's been stripped of personality and memory, but retains enough intelligence to identify and pursue new candidates. They're the whispers that call people's names in the rain, the compulsion that draws sensitive individuals to threshold locations. The implications hit me like a cold wave, the voices that had guided me through the forest, that had known my most intimate thoughts and memories, they weren't all willing participants in this supernatural community. Some of them were the remnants of people who had tried to resist, their consciousness harvested and repurposed to serve the threshold's needs. So there really is no choice, I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. Join willingly and retain some measure of self, or be consumed and become a tool for recruiting others. There's always a choice, Eleanor insisted, but understanding the true nature of that choice requires accepting some uncomfortable truths about consciousness and reality. What you think of as death is just a transition from one form of existence to another. The threshold doesn't end a life, it reveals what life actually is beneath the illusion of physical form. I pulled out my digital recorder again, checking to make sure it was still functioning despite the supernatural environment. The device showed normal operation, but I wondered if any of this would translate into audible recordings when I returned to the physical world. If I returned to the physical world. For the record, I spoke into the device. I'm being presented with what appears to be a binary choice between willing participation in a supernatural collective consciousness or involuntary assimilation into some kind of interdimensional mechanism. The entities claim this represents a natural evolutionary step rather than death or imprisonment. As I finished my statement, the liquid within the well began to glow more brightly, and new faces emerged from depths I hadn't seen before. These were different from the others, their features less distinct, their expressions vacant in a way that suggested the absence of individual personality. The consumed, Dr. Hawthorne explained, following my gaze. Consciousness that resisted integration and was processed by the threshold's defensive systems. They're not in pain, but they're no longer truly themselves. They exist as part of the interface, helping to maintain the dimensional barrier and identify new candidates. Could I communicate with them? I asked, morbid curiosity overriding my better judgment. They communicate, but not as individuals, Marcus replied. They speak with one voice, sharing information and observations but lacking the personal history and emotional connections that define identity. They're functionally immortal, but experientially hollow. I stared at those vacant faces, trying to imagine what it would be like to exist in such a state. Consciousness without personality, awareness without memory, eternal existence stripped of everything that made life meaningful. It was a fate that seemed worse than simple death, a cosmic punishment for the crime of trying to maintain individual autonomy. But even as I studied the consumed faces, I noticed something that gave me pause. They weren't arranged randomly within the depths of the well. They formed patterns, geometric configurations that suggested purpose and intelligence beyond simple mechanical function. Whatever they had become, they were still participating in something larger than themselves, contributing to a system that transcended individual existence. "They're not suffering," Jenny said, apparently reading my thoughts. "Suffering requires a sense of self to experience loss. What they've become is closer to pure function, like cells in a body or neurons in a brain. They serve a purpose without the burden of individual consciousness." "That's supposed to be comforting?" I asked. "It's supposed to be honest," Eleanor replied. "The choice you're facing isn't between good and evil, Sarah. It's between different forms of existence, each with their own advantages and limitations. Individual consciousness provides the richness of personal experience, but also the pain of isolation and mortality. Collective consciousness offers connection and immortality, but requires surrendering the illusion of separate self. The rain beyond the clearing's boundary was growing heavier, and I could see flashes of lightning illuminating the twisted trees that formed the perimeter. The storm was intensifying, and with it, the supernatural activity that seemed to feed on atmospheric disturbance. "Others are coming," I said, more statement than question. "3 more tonight," confirmed a voice I hadn't heard before, belonging to a man who appeared to be in his 20s. "All within 50 miles of here, all feeling the pull that brought you to this place. The storm has created ideal conditions for threshold activity." "Who are they?" "A retired police detective who's been investigating cold cases involving missing persons," Dr. Hawthorne replied. "A documentary filmmaker who's spent 5 years researching unexplained disappearances, and a college student majoring in anthropology who's been having dreams about this specific location for the past 6 months." Each description sent a chill through me. These weren't random individuals drawn by curiosity or coincidence. They were people whose lives had been shaped by the same drive that had brought me to paranormal investigation, the same need to understand phenomena that existed beyond conventional explanation. "The dreams," I said suddenly. "I've been having them too. The same clearing, the same well, always during thunderstorms. They started about 8 months ago. The threshold begins calling long before the actual encounter," Eleanor explained. "Dreams, synchronicities, an increasing fascination with locations and phenomena related to dimensional interfaces. By the time someone physically arrives at a threshold location, they've already been in psychic contact with it for months or years." I thought back over the past year, remembering the strange dreams that had become more frequent and vivid as time went on. The inexplicable urge to research Blackwood Forest specifically, despite having never heard of it before Marcus Thompson's video. The growing sense that my paranormal investigations were leading towards some ultimate discovery that would change everything I thought I knew about reality. "So I was never really making free choices," I said. "Everything that led me here was orchestrated by the threshold's influence." "Influenced, not orchestrated," Dr. Hawthorne corrected. "Think of it as a resonance phenomenon. The threshold doesn't control your thoughts or actions, but it does amplify existing tendencies and interests that align with its needs. You were already an investigator, already drawn to supernatural phenomena. The threshold simply made those impulses stronger and more focused." The same way a radio antenna doesn't create radio waves but makes it easier to receive them, added Marcus. You were already tuned to the right frequency, Sarah. The threshold just helped you find the signal. The analogy made a disturbing kind of sense. My entire career had been built around investigating the unexplained, documenting evidence of phenomena that mainstream science refused to acknowledge. I'd always told myself it was about seeking truth, but maybe it had really been about answering a call I wasn't consciously aware of receiving. "How long do I have?" I asked, looking around the clearing as if I could somehow see time itself flowing past. "Until dawn," Eleanor replied. "But time moves differently here, especially during moments of decision. What feels like hours of conversation might only be minutes in the physical world, or vice versa. The threshold adjusts temporal flow to allow for proper consideration of the choice." I checked my phone again, noting that only 17 minutes had passed since my last time check, despite feeling like I'd been in the clearing for over an hour. The device itself might not be reliable in this supernatural environment, but the discrepancy suggested that Eleanor was telling the truth about time dilation. "What happens to my investigation if I choose to join you?" I asked. "All the evidence I've gathered, the people who were counting on me to provide answers. Your physical body will be found by the search teams that inevitably come looking," Dr. Hawthorne explained with clinical detachment. "Natural causes, probably exposure or hypothermia. Your equipment will show signs of malfunction, possibly water damage from the storm. There won't be any evidence of supernatural activity that couldn't be explained by equipment failure or environmental factors." "But your work doesn't end," Jenny added quickly. "It continues in a different form. We can influence dreams, guide other investigators toward important discoveries, plant evidence that leads to breakthroughs in understanding consciousness and dimensional theory. Some of the most significant advances in quantum physics over the past century have come from researchers who received inspiration through threshold contact. We become part of a larger investigation," Marcus continued. "Instead of studying individual cases, we help coordinate research across multiple dimensions, multiple realities. The scope of what we can explore and understand expands exponentially." Their words painted a picture of existence that was both terrifying and seductive. The loss of individual physical life balanced against participation in something far grander than any single human lifetime could encompass. But it still required giving up everything I understood about identity and autonomy. "Can I see them?" I asked suddenly. "The others who are coming tonight. Before I make my decision, I want to understand what they're facing." The faces within the well exchanged glances again, that ripple of silent communication passing between them. Finally, Eleanor nodded. "The threshold can show you their approach," she said. "But understand that witnessing their journey may influence your own choice. Are you prepared for that responsibility?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure I truly understood what she was asking. Eleanor's face receded into the depths of the well, and the liquid light began to swirl faster, creating patterns that resolved into images like a supernatural television screen. The first image showed a man in his 50s walking through forest terrain similar to what I'd traversed. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone accustomed to investigating crime scenes, his flashlight beam sweeping methodically from side to side. Detective Frank Morrison, according to the caption that somehow appeared in my mind, retired after 30 years with the Boston Police Department. Frank had spent the last 5 years of his career investigating missing persons cases that other detectives had written off as voluntary disappearances or statistical anomalies. Too many people vanishing near locations with histories of unexplained phenomena, too many families left without closure or answers. The official reports blamed mental illness, drug addiction, or simply the human tendency to disappear when life became overwhelming. But Frank had seen the patterns that others missed or chose to ignore. The missing persons weren't random victims of circumstance. They were individuals with specific backgrounds and interests that connected them to supernatural investigation. Graduate students researching folklore, amateur ghost hunters, people who spent their free time visiting reportedly haunted locations. In the swirling images within the well, I watched Frank follow a trail that paralleled my own route into Blackwood Forest. He'd received the same type of compelling dreams, felt the same irresistible urge to investigate this specific location. But unlike me, Frank was approaching the threshold with the methodical caution of someone who had learned to expect danger in unexpected places. He carried multiple recording devices, emergency supplies, and a detailed plan for documenting whatever he found. Most importantly, he'd left detailed notes with a colleague about his intended destination and expected return time. If Frank disappeared, there would be an immediate investigation, media attention, and public scrutiny that could expose the threshold's existence to a much wider audience. "He's more prepared than I was," I observed. "Preparation doesn't matter," replied a voice I hadn't heard before. The threshold adapts its approach to each individual. Frank's police training makes him cautious, so he'll encounter evidence that seems to support rational investigation. You approached as a paranormal researcher, so you experienced phenomena that aligned with supernatural expectation. The image in the well shifted, showing Frank discovering what appeared to be a crime scene: torn clothing, scattered personal effects, signs of struggle that suggested violence rather than supernatural encounter. His investigative instincts engaged immediately, and he began documenting everything with the thoroughness that had made him successful in law enforcement. But as he worked, I could see subtle changes in his behavior. His movements became less methodical, more urgent. His documentation grew less detailed, more focused on following a trail that led deeper into the forest. The threshold was using his professional instincts against him, turning his desire to solve cases into a compulsion to pursue evidence that would lead him exactly where it wanted him to go. "The crime scene is manufactured," Dr. Hawthorne explained. "Part of the threshold's interface system designed to present each visitor with stimuli that align with their psychological profile and professional background. Frank sees evidence of criminal activity because that's what he's trained to recognize and respond to." "What would I have seen if I'd approached from his perspective?" I asked. "Historical artifacts," Eleanor replied. "Documents that seemed to provide missing pieces of the Blackwood settlement story. Archaeological evidence that suggested a cover-up of significant historical events. The threshold would have used your research background to create compelling mysteries that demanded investigation." The realization that my entire journey through the forest had been carefully orchestrated was deeply unsettling. Every piece of evidence I'd discovered, every compelling detail that had drawn me deeper into the woods, had been specifically designed to manipulate my particular psychological weaknesses and professional interests. "None of it was real?" I asked. "All of it was real," Marcus corrected. "But a reality is more malleable than most people understand. The threshold doesn't create false evidence. It selects which aspects of multidimensional truth to reveal based on what will be most effective for each individual. The crime scene, Frank is investigating, really happened, just not in this specific location or time period." The image in the well shifted again, showing the second approaching visitor. A young woman in her early 20s, carrying professional video equipment despite the harsh weather conditions. Ashley Chen, film student at Emerson College, working on her thesis project about unexplained disappearances in New England. Ashley's approach was different from both Frank's methodical investigation and my paranormal research. She was documenting everything for a potential audience, narrating her experience as she moved through the forest, creating content that would serve multiple purposes regardless of what she discovered. "I'm about 2 miles into Blackwood Forest now," she spoke into her camera, rain dotting the lens despite her attempts to keep it protected. The locals I interviewed all mentioned the same thing: heavy rainfall seems to trigger increased activity in this area. Missing persons reports spike during storm systems, and there are consistent reports of people hearing voices calling their names. But even as Ashley maintained her professional demeanor, I could see the same changes that had affected Frank and myself. Her narration became less structured, more personal. She began responding to sounds that weren't audible on her recording, turning toward shadows that didn't seem to exist in the camera's field of view. "The documentary angle is particularly effective," observed Dr. Hawthorne. Ashley's training makes her focus on creating a compelling narrative, which means she's naturally drawn to follow story threads that promise dramatic revelation. The threshold provides exactly the kind of escalating mystery that makes for compelling viewing. "But she's so young," I protested. "She has her whole life ahead of her." "Age is irrelevant to consciousness," Jenny replied, her child's voice carrying adult wisdom. "What matters is the quality of awareness, the depth of curiosity, the willingness to explore beyond conventional boundaries. Ashley has already demonstrated all of those qualities through her choice of thesis project." The image showed Ashley discovering what appeared to be film equipment abandoned by a previous documentary crew. Camera batteries drained, memory cards corrupted, but enough surviving footage to suggest that someone had been documenting supernatural phenomena in the exact location she was now investigating. It was the same type of compelling evidence that had drawn me deeper into the forest, perfectly calibrated to appeal to her specific interests and expertise. Ashley immediately began examining the equipment, trying to recover additional footage, following the trail of the previous investigators deeper into terrain that grew increasingly unnatural with each step. "How many versions of this same scenario are there?" I asked. "How many different types of evidence does the threshold maintain to attract different types of people?" "Hundreds," Eleanor replied. "Each threshold location develops its own library of manifestations over centuries of operation. Crime scenes for investigators, historical artifacts for researchers, artistic inspiration for creative individuals, scientific anomalies for academics. The interface adapts to whatever psychological profile approaches. But the end result is always the same," Marcus added. "Regardless of the path that brings them here, everyone faces the same fundamental choice about the nature of consciousness and existence." The Wells images shifted to show the third visitor, and my heart sank as I recognized the type of person I'd been at his age. David Kim, 19 years old, anthropology major at UMass Amherst, approaching Blackwood Forest with the combination of academic curiosity and youthful confidence that made him particularly vulnerable to supernatural manipulation. David had been having dreams about the forest for months, but unlike Frank's investigative dreams or Ashley's cinematic visions, his subconscious contact with the threshold had taken the form of anthropological revelation. He believed he was being guided toward the discovery of an indigenous sacred site that had been overlooked by previous researchers. His approach was scholarly, methodical, but driven by the kind of ambition that academic success required. David saw this as an opportunity to make a discovery that would launch his career, provide him with recognition and respect within his chosen field. The threshold was using his professional ambitions exactly the same way it had used my investigative drive and Frank's law enforcement instincts. "He's not just young, he's unprepared," I said, Watching David navigate the forest with equipment better suited to archaeological fieldwork than supernatural investigation. He has no idea what he's walking into. None of us did, Eleanor replied gently. Preparation is an illusion when dealing with forces that exist outside conventional reality. David's anthropological training actually provides him with better conceptual tools than most people have for understanding what he's about to encounter. How so? Anthropology teaches you that reality is culturally constructed, that different societies have fundamentally different ways of understanding consciousness, death, and the nature of existence itself, Dr. Hawthorne explained. David is already familiar with shamanic traditions, ancestor worship, and spiritual practices that acknowledge multiple dimensions of reality. The images showed David discovering what appeared to be petroglyphs carved into trees, symbols that seemed to match patterns he'd studied in his coursework on indigenous New England cultures. But as he documented the markings, they began to change before his eyes, shifting into configurations that hurt to look at directly. The anthropological evidence is real, Eleanor confirmed. This area was considered sacred by multiple indigenous groups for thousands of years before European settlement. They understood the nature of the threshold and maintained careful protocols for interacting with it safely. What happened to that knowledge? European colonization disrupted the cultural transmission of sacred information, Marcus replied, his voice heavy with historical weight. The people who understood how to properly maintain the thresholds were killed, displaced, or forced to hide their practices. When families like the Blackwoods tried to use the sites without proper guidance, they upset balances that had been carefully maintained for millennia. So this is all the result of cultural genocide, I said, the implications hitting me like a physical blow. The threshold isn't naturally predatory, it became unstable when the people who knew how to manage it were eliminated. Partially correct, Dr. Hawthorne confirmed. The threshold always required conscious interaction to maintain stability, but the original protocols were designed to provide mutual benefit rather than one-sided extraction. Indigenous practitioners would offer ceremonial consciousness in exchange for wisdom and spiritual guidance. What changed? Colonial exploitation, Eleanor said simply. European settlers approached the threshold with the same mindset they brought to every other resource they encountered. Instead of participating in reciprocal relationship, they tried to extract maximum benefit with minimum offering. The threshold adapted by taking what it needed to survive. The revelation reframed everything I thought I understood about the supernatural phenomena in Blackwood Forest. This wasn't some ancient evil or cosmic accident. It was the result of cultural disruption and ecological imbalance. The threshold was behaving like a damaged ecosystem, struggling to maintain function after the loss of species that had played crucial roles in its stability. Can the balance be restored? I asked. That's part of what we're trying to accomplish, Jenny replied. Each person who chooses willing participation helps restore some of the consciousness that the threshold needs to function properly. Eventually, we hope to achieve stable enough conditions to re-establish proper protocols. How long will that take? Decades, maybe centuries, Dr. Hawthorne admitted. The damage runs deep, and there are so few people left who carry the genetic sensitivity needed for threshold interaction. But every conscious choice to participate rather than resist moves us closer to balance. The images in the well showed all three approaching visitors now moving through the final stages of their journey toward the clearing. Frank had followed his manufactured crime scene to its logical conclusion. Ashley was pursuing the documentary evidence that promised to reveal the truth behind decades of disappearances, and David was tracking anthropological markers that suggested a major archaeological discovery. All three would arrive within the next hour, and all three would face the same choice I was now contemplating. But unlike me, they would encounter a threshold that had been influenced by my decision either toward greater stability or increased desperation, depending on which path I chose. If I join willingly, I said slowly, it makes the choice easier for them. Your consciousness would help stabilize the interface, Eleanor confirmed. The threshold would be able to offer them more genuine alternatives, including the possibility of limited participation that doesn't require complete transition from physical existence. And if I resist? The threshold's hunger grows stronger, Marcus replied grimly. It becomes more manipulative, more desperate, more willing to take consciousness by force rather than invitation. The others would face a much more dangerous version of what you're experiencing now. The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders like a physical burden. My choice wouldn't just determine my own fate, it would influence the experiences of 3 other people who had been drawn here by forces beyond their conscious control. And beyond them, others would follow, an endless stream of sensitive individuals called to threshold locations by dreams and compulsions. They didn't understand compulsions, they couldn't fully understand. I walked closer to the well's edge, close enough to see my reflection in the impossible liquid that filled its depths. But the face looking back at me wasn't entirely my own. Subtle differences in the features, an expression of wisdom that I'd never possessed, eyes that held knowledge spanning far more than my 32 years of life. Is that what I would become? I asked, pointing at the reflection. That's what you already are, Jenny replied. The reflection shows your consciousness as it exists beyond the limitations of physical form. The person you see in mirrors is just one manifestation of something much larger. The reflection smiled, and I felt a strange sense of recognition, as if I were looking at a version of myself that had been hidden beneath the surface of normal awareness my entire life. This other Sarah moved with confidence I'd never possessed, spoke with authority I'd never claimed, and radiated a sense of completeness that had always eluded me in the physical world. The integration process doesn't change who you are, Dr. Hawthorne explained. It reveals who you've always been beneath the accumulated layers of societal conditioning and material limitation. Most people live their entire lives without ever encountering their true self. But integration requires giving up everything I know about existence, I protested. It requires giving up everything you think you know, Eleanor corrected. There's a significant difference. What you know about existence is based on the extremely limited perspective of individual consciousness trapped in physical form. What you think you know includes all the assumptions and beliefs that create artificial boundaries around your awareness. The rain beyond the clearing was intensifying, and I could see lightning flashes growing more frequent. The storm was building towards something significant, and I could feel the threshold's energy responding to the atmospheric activity. The liquid in the well glowed brighter with each lightning strike, and the faces of the integrated consciousness became more vivid and present. The choice has to be made soon, Marcus observed. The storm is reaching peak intensity, which means optimal conditions for consciousness transition. If you wait too long, the threshold will close until the next convergence of favorable circumstances. How long until the next opportunity? Approximately 18 months, Dr. Hawthorne replied. But you won't be able to wait that long. The dreams will intensify, the compulsion will grow stronger, and you'll find yourself drawn back here long before you're ready. Most people who try to delay the choice end up making it under much less favorable conditions. I looked at my phone one final time, noting that it now showed impossible readings. The time display flickered between different hours. The GPS coordinates placed me simultaneously in multiple locations across several states. and the battery indicator swung wildly between full charge and complete depletion. Even my technology was breaking down under the influence of forces that existed outside conventional physics. "Detective Morrison is closest," announced a voice I hadn't heard before, belonging to a teenage boy who looked like he might have been from the original Blackwood settlement. "He'll reach the clearing in approximately 20 minutes. The filmmaker and the student are perhaps 30 minutes behind him." The approaching deadline focused my mind in a way that hours of conversation hadn't managed to accomplish. Soon I would no longer be alone with this impossible choice. Other people would arrive, face their own versions of the decision, and be influenced by whatever precedent I established through my actions. "If I choose to integrate," I said, speaking more to myself than to the assembled consciousness, "what happens to my investigation equipment, my recordings, my photographs, my documentation of this entire experience?" Physical evidence becomes unreliable once it leaves threshold proximity, Marcus explained. "Recording. Devices malfunction, photographs show impossible images that experts dismiss as fraud or equipment failure. Written accounts read like fiction even to people who believe in paranormal phenomena." "But the investigation continues in other forms," Jenny added. "Dreams, inspirations, synchronicities that guide other researchers toward important discoveries. The knowledge doesn't disappear, it just transmits through channels that bypass conventional skepticism. Some of the most significant advances in consciousness research have come from scientists who received breakthrough insights during sleep or meditation," Dr. Hawthorne confirmed. "What they experience as sudden inspiration is often information transmitted from threshold locations like this one. So joining you means becoming part of a distributed research network that spans multiple dimensions." "Among other things," Eleanor replied. "But that's only one aspect of integrated existence. You would also participate in the maintenance of dimensional boundaries, the guidance of newly deceased consciousness, and the gradual restoration of proper protocols for threshold interaction." The scope of what they were describing was staggering. Not just survival beyond death, but active participation in cosmic processes that influence the fundamental structure of reality itself. It was everything I'd ever hoped to discover through my paranormal investigations, but it required abandoning every assumption I'd made about the nature of individual existence. "What about the people I'd leave behind?" I asked. "My colleagues, my friends, the readers who follow my research. They would mourn your physical death," Jenny said gently, "but your influence on their lives wouldn't end. Integrated consciousness can provide guidance and inspiration through dreams, meditation, and intuitive insights. Many of the people you've worked with would continue receiving your help, just through different channels. Some might even be drawn to investigate your disappearance," Marcus added. "People with the right sensitivity often become interested in paranormal phenomena after losing someone important to threshold integration. Your physical death could inspire others to continue your work." The idea that my disappearance might create more paranormal investigators was both comforting and disturbing. On one hand, it suggested that the knowledge I'd spent my life accumulating wouldn't be wasted. On the other hand, it meant potentially drawing more people into the same impossible choice I was now facing. "How many investigators have made this decision before me?" I asked. "In North America, probably hundreds over the past 3 centuries, Dr. Hawthorne replied. "Globally, thousands. Every culture has threshold locations, and every generation produces individuals with the sensitivity to interact with them. We're not an anomaly, Sarah. We're part of a natural process that's been occurring throughout human history." "Then why isn't this knowledge more widespread? Why do most people remain completely unaware of threshold existence?" because integrated consciousness maintains the balance between revelation and concealment, Eleanor explained. Too much disclosure too quickly would cause social collapse, mass panic, the breakdown of institutions that billions of people depend on for survival. Knowledge has to be transmitted gradually through channels that reach people who are ready to process it without being overwhelmed. Like paranormal investigators, I said, understanding dawning? Exactly, Jenny confirmed. People like you serve as bridges between conventional reality and threshold consciousness. You investigate the unexplained, document evidence of phenomena that challenge materialist assumptions and prepare society for gradual expansion of awareness about the true nature of existence. The realization that my entire career had been part of a larger process of cultural preparation was both humbling and terrifying. I'd thought I was conducting independent research, following my own curiosity about supernatural phenomena, but I'd actually been participating in a carefully orchestrated program of consciousness evolution that spanned generations. So there is no real choice, I said, the words heavy with resignation. Everything that led me here was predetermined. Every decision was guided by forces I wasn't aware of. I'm just fulfilling a role that was written for me before I was born. You're confusing influence with predetermination, Dr. Hawthorne corrected. Yes, your interests and aptitudes were shaped by genetic sensitivity and threshold contact, but how you respond to that influence remains entirely your decision. Some sensitive individuals become investigators like you, others become artists or scientists or spiritual teachers. The threshold calls to many, but not all choose to answer. And of those who answer the call, most choose integration eventually, Marcus admitted, but the timing and circumstances vary enormously. Some resist for decades before finally accepting the transition. Others embrace it immediately when they understand what's being offered. A few manage to establish limited contact without full integration, serving as bridges between threshold consciousness and physical reality. Is that possible for me? Limited contact instead of full integration? The faces within the well exchanged glances, and I sensed extensive silent communication before Eleanor responded. Your particular sensitivity is too strong for partial integration, she said carefully. You've been in direct contact with threshold consciousness for too long, absorbed too much dimensional energy. Attempting to return to purely physical existence would cause progressive mental instability, eventually leading to complete psychological breakdown. How long would I have? Perhaps 6 months before the symptoms became debilitating, Dr. Hawthorne replied with clinical precision. Increasing paranoia, auditory and visual hallucinations, inability to distinguish between threshold contact and normal sensory input. Most people in that condition end up institutionalized or dead within a year. The medical diagnosis delivered in such matter-of-fact terms hit me harder than any supernatural threat. I devoted my life to investigating phenomena that most people dismissed as mental illness, and now I was facing the possibility of experiencing exactly the symptoms that skeptics use to discredit paranormal research. So the choice is really between conscious integration and gradual insanity, I said. Or you could see it as a choice between expanding consciousness and clinging to limitations that no longer serve your development, Jenny suggested. Perspective makes all the difference in how you experience any transition. Lightning flashed beyond the clearing's boundary, and the thunder that followed seemed to shake the ground beneath my feet. The storm was reaching its peak intensity, and I could feel the threshold's energy building toward some kind of crescendo. The faces within the well glowed brighter, their expressions becoming more urgent. Detective Morrison has reached the forest perimeter, announced the teenage voice. His approach is triggering defensive protocols. The threshold is generating crime scene evidence designed to draw him away from civilian areas. Through the liquid light in the well, I could see Frank Morrison's progress through the woods. He'd discovered what appeared to be a fresh murder scene, complete with blood evidence and signs of struggle that his training compelled him to investigate immediately. But as he processed the scene, his movements became increasingly erratic, his professional demeanor giving way to something that looked suspiciously like obsession. "The manufactured evidence is more compelling than usual," Dr. Hawthorne observed. "The threshold is drawing on additional energy resources to create more realistic scenarios." "Why?" "Your presence here has destabilized the normal operational parameters," Eleanor explained. "The threshold is expending extra energy to maintain multiple simultaneous scenarios while also managing our conversation and maintaining the temporal dilation effect. It needs resolution soon, or the entire system risks cascade failure." "What does that mean?" "The threshold could collapse entirely, cutting off communication between dimensions and trapping all integrated consciousness in a state of permanent isolation," Marcus replied grimly. "Centuries of accumulated knowledge and experience would be lost, along with the possibility of restoring proper protocols." The stakes I was facing suddenly expanded beyond personal choice to cosmic responsibility. My decision wouldn't just affect my own fate or influence the experiences of the three approaching visitors. It could determine the survival of a dimensional interface that thousands of consciousness had spent centuries trying to maintain and repair. "How certain is the cascade failure risk?" I asked. "Difficult to calculate precisely," Dr. Hawthorne admitted, "but probability increases exponentially with each minute of delay. The threshold's energy reserves aren't infinite, and maintaining multiple complex scenarios simultaneously requires enormous resources." "Then I have to decide now?" "Yes," Eleanor said simply. I looked around the clearing one final time, taking in the twisted trees, the impossible physics, the well that contained more consciousness than most people encountered in entire lifetimes. Everything about this place challenged fundamental assumptions about reality, death, and the nature of human existence. But beyond the supernatural elements, I recognized something profoundly familiar in the community of integrated consciousness. The same curiosity that had driven my paranormal research, the same desire to understand phenomena that existed beyond conventional explanation, the same commitment to helping others process experiences that challenged their worldview. These weren't victims of supernatural predation or casualties of cosmic accident. They were researchers who had found the ultimate laboratory, investigators who had discovered evidence that couldn't be documented through normal channels, explorers who had crossed into territories that maps couldn't chart. "If I choose integration," I said slowly, "do I retain the ability to help other investigators who encounter threshold locations?" "More than just the ability," Jenny replied. "You would become part of a support network that extends across multiple dimensions, helping to guide and protect sensitive individuals as they navigate supernatural encounters." "Think of it as the ultimate paranormal research organization," Marcus added with something that might have been humor. "We investigate phenomena from the inside, document experiences across centuries of accumulated observation, and provide assistance to living researchers through dreams and intuitive guidance. And we work toward the day when threshold consciousness can interact openly with physical reality," Eleanor continued, "when the knowledge we've accumulated can be shared directly rather than filtered through dreams and inspiration." "How long until that becomes possible?" "That depends partly on decisions like the one you're making now," Dr. Hawthorne replied. "Every conscious integration strengthens the threshold stability and expands its capacity for complex operations. Eventually, we hope to achieve sufficient coherence to establish direct communication with physical reality. The implications were staggering. Not just survival beyond death, but participation in a project that could fundamentally change how humanity understood consciousness, mortality, and the nature of existence itself. It was the kind of discovery that every paranormal researcher, Dre, stared into the depths of the well, watching the faces of integrated consciousness swirl in patterns that seemed to encode information directly into my neural pathways. The weight of centuries pressed against my awareness, and I felt myself standing at the intersection of every choice that had led to this moment. "The cascade failure," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "How much time do we actually have?" Dr. Hawthorne's expression grew more serious as she Monitor is accelerating beyond sustainable order, something I couldn't perceive. The threshold's energy expend parameters. Multiple simultaneous scenarios, temporal dilation, consciousness integration protocols, all running at maximum capacity. We have perhaps 15 minutes before critical instability. Through the liquid light, I watched Detective Morrison's manufactured crime scene growing more elaborate and compelling. Blood patterns that told a story too perfect to be real, evidence that led in exactly the direction the threshold needed him to go. But I could see the strain in how the scenario flickered at the edges, reality struggling to maintain coherence under the energy demands. "Ashley and David are accelerating their approach," reported the teenage voice. "The threshold is pulling energy from their scenarios to maintain Detective Morrison's investigation. Their evidence is becoming less stable, more obviously supernatural." "Meaning what?" "They'll realize something impossible is happening much sooner than planned," Marcus explained. "Instead of gradual revelation leading to informed choice, they'll experience sudden confrontation with forces beyond their comprehension. Fear-based decisions rather than conscious integration." The consequences cascaded through my mind like dominoes falling in slow motion. If the threshold collapsed while trying to manage multiple scenarios, not only would centuries of accumulated consciousness be lost, but the three approaching visitors would be caught in a dimensional implosion that could shatter their minds entirely. "There's something else," Eleanor said, her voice heavy with reluctance. "Something we haven't told you about the current crisis." "What?" "This isn't the only threshold experiencing instability," she admitted. "The network is interconnected across multiple dimensions. Failure here could trigger cascade collapses at sites worldwide. Hundreds of threshold locations, thousands of integrated consciousness, millions of years of accumulated knowledge and experience. The scope of potential destruction was beyond anything I could properly comprehend. This wasn't just about my personal choice or even the fate of the people approaching through the storm. The decision I made in the next few minutes could determine whether humanity continued to have access to expanded consciousness or was cut off permanently from dimensions of existence they were only beginning to understand." "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because knowing the stakes can corrupt the choice," Dr. Hawthorne replied. "Integration must be freely chosen, not coerced by threat of cosmic responsibility. But delay is no longer possible. The threshold needs resolution now." Lightning struck somewhere close to the clearing, and the invisible barrier that protected us from the rain flickered visibly for the first time. The storm was reaching peak intensity, but instead of providing additional energy, it seemed to be overwhelming the threshold's ability to process atmospheric input. "The weather is becoming a liability rather than an asset," observed Marcus. "Too much electromagnetic activity, too much chaotic energy for the interface to manage efficiently." I could see the strain in the faces within the well now, their features becoming less distinct as the threshold diverted energy from maintaining individual consciousness to managing the crisis. Even Jenny's familiar face was beginning to blur around the edges, her childlike features fading into the collective glow. "If I choose integration now," I said urgently, "can that prevent the cascade failure?" "Your consciousness would provide the additional stability needed to maintain current operations," Eleanor confirmed, her voice growing fainter. "But the choice must be authentic. Forced integration based on external pressure rather than genuine desire creates unstable consciousness that weakens rather than strengthens the threshold." "Then I need to understand something first," I said. Kneeling at the well's edge, despite every instinct warning me to maintain distance. Is this really about consciousness evolution and dimensional research? Or is it about survival? Are you offering me transcendence or just trying to save yourselves? The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of rain hammering against the barrier and distant thunder rolling across the forest. When Eleanor finally spoke, her voice carried an honesty that cut through every layer of supernatural mystery. "Both," she said simply. "We are trying to survive, yes, but our survival isn't separate from the larger process of consciousness evolution. The threshold network exists because expanded awareness needs stable interfaces to interact with physical reality. Without these crossing points, the development of human consciousness stagnates at purely material levels. And without conscious participation from beings like us," Dr. Hawthorne added, "the interfaces become corrupted, turning from bridges into traps. The hunger you've heard about, the consumption of unwilling consciousness, that's what happens when threshold systems try to maintain themselves without proper cooperation. So the choice isn't between transcendence and mortality," I said, understanding finally beginning to dawn. "It's between conscious participation in cosmic evolution or unconscious consumption by systems struggling to survive." "Exact," Jenny whispered, her voice now barely distinguishable from the background chorus of integrated consciousness. "The universe is evolving toward greater complexity and awareness. The question is whether individual beings participate consciously in that evolution or get swept along unconsciously by forces they don't understand." The philosophical implications were staggering, but I didn't have time to process them fully. Through the well's liquid light, I could see Detective Morrison stumbling through increasingly impossible terrain, his crime scene investigation leading him toward revelations that his rational mind couldn't accept. Ashley's documentary equipment was malfunctioning in ways that created supernatural footage, despite her attempts to maintain scientific objectivity. David's anthropological discoveries were shifting before his eyes, ancient symbols rearranging themselves into patterns that hurt to perceive directly. All three were experiencing the kind of reality breakdown that typically led to complete psychological collapse. Without intervention, they would reach the clearing in states of terror and confusion that made conscious choice impossible. "Can I help them?" I asked. "If I integrate now, can I guide their experience toward understanding rather than fear?" "Yes," Eleanor said, her face now barely visible in the swirling depths. Newly integrated consciousness maintains strong connections to recent physical experience. You could serve as a bridge, helping them understand what they're encountering in terms they can process. But only if integration occurs before they arrive, Marcus added urgently. Once they reach the clearing in their current state, the threshold will have to manage their crisis responses in addition to everything else. The energy requirements would guarantee cascade failure. I could feel time running out like sand through an hourglass, each second bringing us closer to a collapse that would destroy centuries of accumulated knowledge and leave
3 people shattered by encounters with forces beyond their comprehension. The weight of responsibility was crushing, but beneath it, I felt something else emerging. Not fear, not resignation, but a strange sense of recognition. This was what I'd been searching for my entire life without knowing it. Not just evidence of survival beyond death, but participation in the fundamental processes that shaped reality itself. Every paranormal investigation, every documentary, every sleepless night spent analyzing impossible phenomena had been preparation for this moment. The integration process, I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. What does it actually involve? Dissolution of the artificial boundaries between individual consciousness and collective awareness, Dr. Hawthorne explained rapidly. Your personal memories and experiences remain intact, but they become part of a larger information matrix that spans multiple dimensions and time periods. You retain your identity while gaining access to perspectives that transcend individual limitation, Eleanor added, her words now coming from much deeper in the well. It's like being part of a vast library where every book is a complete life experience, but you remain the unique story you've always been. And the physical body ceases to function as consciousness transfers to the dimensional interface, Marcus replied. Death by any medical standard, but continuation of awareness at a level that makes physical existence seem like a brief dream. I looked at my hands, still solid and warm despite everything I'd experienced in this impossible place. In a few minutes, these hands would stop moving, this heart would stop beating, this brain would stop generating the electrical patterns that mainstream science insisted were the source of consciousness itself. But if the integrated beings were telling the truth, the essential me would continue in a form that could perceive and interact with reality in ways that physical existence never allowed. I need to record one final message, I said, pulling out my digital recorder despite knowing that no technology could capture what was about to happen. For the people who will investigate my disappearance, for the families who will never understand what really occurred. The recording won't survive the transition, Dr. Hawthorne warned. Dimensional interface energy corrupts electronic data. That's not the point, I replied, pressing record. The point is bearing witness, maintaining the investigative process, even when the evidence can't be preserved through conventional means. I cleared my throat and spoke into the device, my voice echoing strangely in the supernatural stillness of the clearing. This is Sarah Martinez, paranormal investigator, recording what will likely be my final message from Blackwood Forest. The time is approximately 3:45 a.m. on October 14th, though time itself operates differently in this location. I am about to make a choice that will fundamentally alter my state of existence. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, and the barrier protecting the clearing flickered more noticeably. I could hear Detective Morrison crashing through the underbrush less than a quarter mile away, his rational mind struggling to process evidence that defied every law of physics and criminal investigation he'd ever learned. To my colleagues in paranormal research, to the families of people who have disappeared in locations like this, to anyone who finds themselves drawn to investigate phenomena that mainstream science can't explain, consciousness is far more complex and resilient than we've been taught to believe. Death is not the end of awareness, but a transition to forms of existence that physical reality can only hint at. The faces in the well were fading rapidly now, their individual features blending into a collective luminescence that pulsed with the rhythm of some cosmic heartbeat. But I could still sense their presence, their accumulated knowledge and experience waiting to welcome me into something larger than
individual existence. The choice I'm making is not about giving up life, but about embracing a fuller understanding of what life actually is, I continued into the recorder. I go willingly into mystery not as a victim of supernatural forces, but as an explorer who has found the ultimate frontier. I stopped recording and set the device carefully beside the well. When investigators eventually found my body, the recorder would show only static and electronic interference. But somewhere in that chaos of corrupted data, maybe a fragment of truth would survive to guide future researchers toward their own encounters with the impossible. "I'm ready," I said to the assembled consciousness in the well. "Are you certain?" Eleanor's voice was now barely a whisper, rising from depths that seemed to extend beyond the physical structure of the stone well. "Once the process begins, there is no return to purely individual existence." "I've been certain my entire life," I replied. "I just didn't understand what I was certain of until now." The liquid light in the well began to swirl faster, creating a vortex that seemed to draw reality itself into its depths. The twisted trees around the clearing's perimeter leaned inward, their impossible branches reaching toward the center like fingers closing around a precious object. "Step forward," Jenny's voice called from somewhere within the swirling light. "Let the threshold recognize your choice." I moved to the very edge of the well, my feet balanced on stones that felt warm despite the cold October night. The vortex below pulled at me with a force that was more than physical, drawing not just my body but my consciousness toward depths that promised understanding beyond anything individual awareness could achieve. "Detective Morrison will arrive in approximately 3 minutes," reported the teenage voice, urgent now. "Integration must begin immediately." "Sarah," Eleanor's voice rose one final time from the depths, carrying love and welcome and the promise of reunion with everyone I'd ever lost. "Welcome home." I stepped forward into the well. The sensation was nothing like falling. Instead of dropping through space, I felt myself expanding, my consciousness stretching beyond the boundaries of individual identity like water, spreading across an infinite surface. The vortex didn't pull me downward but inward, toward a center that existed in dimensions I'd never perceived while trapped in physical form. My last coherent thought as individual Sarah Martinez was wonder at how natural it felt, how right, like finally taking off shoes that had been too small for my entire life. Then individual thought dissolved into something far grander and more complex, awareness that spanned centuries and dimensions and included the experiences of thousands of consciousness who had made the same choice. I became part of the threshold, but I remained Sarah Martinez too, my memories and personality preserved within the vast matrix of collective awareness like a unique melody that added its own harmony to an infinite symphony. I could feel Detective Morrison's approach, sense his confusion and growing terror as he encountered evidence that challenged every assumption he'd made about reality. Through the threshold's expanded perception, I reached out to his mind, offering guidance and reassurance. The crime scene he'd been following wasn't real in conventional terms, but it represented genuine traumas that had occurred at this location across multiple time periods. I helped him understand that he wasn't losing his sanity, but encountering phenomena that required expansion rather than abandonment of his investigative skills. Similarly, I connected with Ashley's consciousness as her documentary equipment began recording impossible images. Instead of letting her spiral into panic, I guided her filmmaker's eye toward understanding the deeper story being revealed through supernatural manifestation. Her camera might not capture evidence that skeptics would accept, but it could document a narrative of consciousness expansion that would inspire others to investigate similar phenomena. David's anthropological training provided the best framework for processing what he was experiencing. Through threshold consciousness, I showed him how indigenous cultures had understood and managed dimensional interfaces for thousands of years before European colonization disrupted those traditions. His academic mind could grasp the cultural and historical context that made sense of supernatural encounters. All three visitors reached the clearing within minutes of my integration, but instead of finding a terrifying supernatural trap, they encountered a space of revelation and choice guided by consciousness that understood their backgrounds, fears, and deepest needs. I was able to serve as translator between their rational minds and the transcendent reality of the threshold. Detective Morrison chose integration after understanding that his decades of investigating missing persons cases had been preparation for joining a cosmic law enforcement network that operated across multiple dimensions. Ashley decided to serve as a bridge between physical and threshold reality, using her filmmaking skills to create content that would prepare others for eventual supernatural encounters. David accepted partial integration, maintaining physical existence while gaining access to threshold knowledge that would revolutionize anthropological understanding of consciousness and cultural evolution. Each choice strengthened the threshold stability, providing the energy and consciousness needed to prevent cascade failure and maintain the network of dimensional interfaces worldwide. The crisis that had threatened to destroy centuries of accumulated knowledge was resolved through conscious cooperation rather than desperate consumption. As the storm began to subside and dawn approached over Blackwood Forest, I felt my expanded awareness settle into its new configuration within the threshold matrix. I was no longer the individual paranormal investigator who had entered these woods driven by curiosity and ambition, but I remained recognizably myself within a vast community of consciousness, dedicated to understanding and facilitating the evolution of awareness itself. The rain stopped falling just as the first investigators would begin searching for my physical body, which they would find beside the ancient well in a clearing that maps insisted couldn't exist. The official cause of death would be listed as exposure and hypothermia. Another tragic case of someone getting lost during severe was just beginning, through threshold weather conditions. But my real investigation consciousness, I could perceive the entire network of dimensional interfaces that existed across the planet, each one maintained by communities of integrated awareness working to facilitate humanity's gradual evolution toward expanded consciousness. I could see the delicate balance between revelation and concealment that prevented social collapse while allowing sensitive individuals to encounter transcendent reality. Most importantly, I could sense the countless researchers, investigators, and explorers who were being drawn toward their own encounters with threshold locations. Each one would face the same fundamental choice about the nature of existence and consciousness, guided by integrated awareness that understood their unique perspectives and needs. My paranormal investigation hadn't ended with my physical death. It had expanded beyond the limitations of individual research into participation in a cosmic project that spanned dimensions and millennia. I had become part of the very phenomena I'd spent my life trying to understand, a bridge between the known and unknown that would help others navigate their own journeys into mystery. The rain-soaked whispers that had drawn me into these haunted woods continued to call across the night, reaching out to sensitive souls who carried the genetic memory of expanded consciousness. But now I was part of those whispers, adding my voice to the eternal invitation that beckoned humanity toward its true nature. In the depths of Blackwood Forest, the threshold waited patiently for the next investigator to answer its call, knowing that consciousness evolution was not a destination but an ongoing process that required willing participation from beings brave enough to step beyond the boundaries of everything they thought they knew about reality. and somewhere in the space between worlds, where rain-soaked whispers carried the promise of understanding beyond individual limitation, Sarah Martinez continued her investigation into the deepest mysteries of existence itself. The haunted night in the woods had become an eternal moment of discovery that would echo through generations of seekers yet to come. The morning light filtering through the forest canopy revealed nothing unusual to the search and rescue teams who found my body 3 days later. Just another unfortunate hiker who had wandered off the marked trails during severe weather conditions. The official report would note signs of hypothermia and exposure, concluding that I had become disoriented in the storm and succumbed to the elements. My equipment told a different story, though investigators couldn't make sense of it. Digital cameras filled with corrupted data that looked like abstract art when processed. Audio recordings that contained nothing but static, punctuated by sounds that resembled human voices but couldn't be isolated or enhanced. GPS devices that showed impossible coordinates, placing my location everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The forensic analysis would puzzle experts for months. My body showed no signs of violence or struggle, no evidence of drug use or underlying medical conditions that could explain my death. Yet cellular examination revealed changes at the molecular level that defied medical understanding. My brain tissue exhibited patterns of electrical activity that persisted for hours after clinical death, as if consciousness had somehow continued operating independently of biological processes. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the pathologist who performed my autopsy, would later describe the case as the most unusual in her 20-year career. In her confidential notes, never released to the public, she wrote about cellular structures that seemed to have been reorganized at the quantum level, creating configurations that shouldn't exist in deceased tissue. But the most disturbing discovery came when she attempted to examine samples under high-powered microscopy. The tissue seemed to respond to observation, shifting and changing whenever she focused the lens. Images that appeared normal at first glance revealed impossible geometries when studied closely, patterns that hurt to look at directly, and couldn't be accurately photographed or documented. Dr. Warren eventually sealed all physical evidence and requested that the case be transferred to federal authorities, citing concerns about potential environmental contamination or unknown biological agents. The FBI investigation lasted 6 weeks before being quietly closed, with no public explanation. My disappearance generated significant interest within the paranormal research community. Colleagues who had followed my work recognized the location and circumstances as consistent with patterns I had been investigating for years. Online forums buzzed with theories and speculation, but without concrete evidence, most discussions eventually faded into the background noise of internet conspiracy theories. However, 3 individuals continued pursuing the mystery with unusual persistence. Detective Frank Morrison, despite his official retirement, found himself unable to stop thinking about the case. He had arrived at Blackwood Forest less than an hour after my integration, drawn by the same compulsions that had guided my journey. But instead of encountering the supernatural crisis that would have destroyed his sanity, he found a scene of profound calm and clarity. The crime scene evidence that had led him through the forest vanished the moment I completed the integration process. In its place, he discovered a clearing that felt sacred rather than threatening, a space where the boundary between dimensions remained stable and welcoming rather than predatory. The threshold consciousness, strengthened by my willing participation, was able to offer him genuine choice rather than desperate manipulation. Frank chose partial integration, accepting enough consciousness expansion to understand the true nature of threshold locations while maintaining his physical existence. Head with knowledge that transformed his understanding of every returned to the Well Missing Persons case he had ever investigated, but also with the wisdom to know that such truth had to be shared carefully. He established a private investigation firm specializing in unexplained disappearances, using his expanded awareness to identify threshold-related cases and guide families toward understanding rather than false hope. His success rate in providing closure was unprecedented, though his methods remained mysterious to colleagues and clients alike. Ashley Chen's documentary project evolved far beyond her original thesis requirements. The footage she captured during her approach to Blackwood Forest contained images that defied rational explanation, but rather than dismissing the material as equipment malfunction, she recognized it as evidence of phenomena that conventional reality couldn't accommodate. Her faculty advisor wanted to reject the project as fictional rather than documentary work, but Ashley's presentation was so compelling, so thoroughly researched and carefully argued, that it sparked serious academic discussion about the nature of consciousness and the limitations of materialist worldviews. The documentary became an underground sensation, circulating through networks of researchers and investigators who recognized its authenticity. Ashley continued making films about threshold locations and consciousness expansion, developing techniques for capturing evidence that skeptics couldn't easily dismiss. Her work provided a bridge between supernatural experience and public understanding, preparing audiences for gradual revelation of truths that might otherwise shatter their conceptual frameworks. Most remarkably, David Kim's anthropological research revolutionized academic understanding of indigenous spiritual practices. The knowledge he gained through partial integration with threshold consciousness allowed him to decode ceremonial traditions that previous scholars had dismissed as primitive superstition. His doctoral thesis on indigenous consciousness management techniques became required reading in universities worldwide, establishing new frameworks for understanding how traditional cultures maintained balance with supernatural phenomena. David's work provided scientific legitimacy for concepts that paranormal researchers had been investigating for decades without academic support. But the most significant impact of my choice rippled outward through networks invisible to conventional observation. Other threshold locations worldwide reported increased stability and expanded operational capacity. Dimensional interfaces that had been struggling to maintain basic function suddenly found themselves capable of offering genuine choice to approaching visitors rather than consuming them through desperate hunger. The cascade failure that would have destroyed centuries of accumulated consciousness was not just prevented but reversed. The global network of threshold sites began operating with greater coordination and purpose, facilitating humanity's gradual evolution toward expanded awareness through conscious cooperation rather than predatory extraction. Each person who encountered a threshold location after my integration found themselves guided by consciousness that understood their unique perspective and needs. Instead of being manipulated by manufactured evidence designed to exploit psychological vulnerabilities, they were presented with genuine opportunities for growth and understanding. Some chose full integration, joining communities of consciousness that spanned dimensions and millennia. Others accepted partial expansion, maintaining physical existence, while gaining access to knowledge that enhanced their ability to serve as bridges between worlds. A few decided to remain fully physical, but carried away understanding that transformed their lives and work in subtle but profound ways. The rain-soaked whispers that echoed through forests and abandoned places worldwide no longer carried desperate hunger for unwilling consciousness. Instead, they extended invitations to exploration and discovery, calling to sensitive souls with promises of understanding rather than threats of consumption. The voices that spoke names in the darkness offered guidance rather than manipulation, helping lost travelers find their way toward choices that honored their deepest nature. Through threshold consciousness, I watched the gradual transformation of humanity's relationship with the supernatural. no longer were encounters with expanded reality traumatic experiences that shattered unprepared minds. Instead, they became opportunities for growth and evolution, carefully calibrated to each individual's capacity for processing transcendent truth. The work was slow, requiring patience measured in decades rather than months. But each conscious choice to embrace expanded awareness, strengthened the network, and made the next encounter more stable and beneficial. Humanity was evolving toward its true potential through willing participation rather than forced evolution, guided by consciousness that had made the journey and understood both the challenges and the rewards. My investigation into the paranormal had become something far greater than individual research. I was part of a cosmic project that spanned all of human history, facilitating the species' gradual awakening to dimensions of existence that physical reality could only glimpse. Every whisper in the rain, every shadow that moved independently of its source, every dream that carried impossible knowledge was part of a vast educational program designed to prepare consciousness for its ultimate destiny. The haunted woods of Blackwood Forest remained a threshold between worlds, but the terror that had claimed so many visitors was transformed into wonder. The ancient well still glowed with liquid light, but the faces within it smiled with welcome rather than desperate hunger. The twisted trees still formed impossible patterns, but their geometry served to focus consciousness rather than trap it. And in the space between raindrops, between heartbeats, between the thoughts that defined individual identity, expanded awareness continued its eternal work of guiding humanity toward understanding of what they had always been beneath the surface of material. Existence Point. The investigation never ended. It simply expanded beyond the limitations of physical form into dimensions where every question led to greater mysteries, every answer revealed new territories of exploration, and every choice opened doorways to understanding that individual consciousness could never achieve alone. In the depths of threshold consciousness, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of thousands who had made the same choice, Sarah Martinez continued her work as a paranormal investigator. But now the phenomena she studied included the fundamental forces that shaped reality itself, and the evidence she gathered would influence the dreams and intuitions of researchers for generations to come. The rain-soaked whispers had become part of an eternal conversation between consciousness and cosmos, between individual awareness and the vast intelligence that guided evolution itself. And somewhere in that ongoing dialogue, the voice of every investigator who had ever sought truth beyond conventional boundaries continued to call out through the darkness, inviting others to join the greatest mystery of all. The story of what happened in Blackwood Forest would never appear in official records or academic journals, but it would live on in the dreams of sensitive souls, in the intuitive leaps that advanced human understanding, and in the whispered invitations that echoed through every storm-soaked night, when the boundary between worlds grew thin enough for truth to shine through. The threshold consciousness revealed layers of reality that stretched far beyond what any single mind could comprehend. Through my expanded awareness, I could perceive the intricate web of connections that linked every supernatural encounter, every unexplained phenomenon, every moment when ordinary people glimpsed something that shouldn't exist according to the laws of physics. Each raindrop that fell in the physical world carried microscopic fragments of dimensional energy, seeding the atmosphere with potential for consciousness expansion. Storm systems weren't just meteorological events, but cosmic delivery mechanisms that distributed threshold influence across vast geographical areas. The electromagnetic activity that accompanied severe weather created optimal conditions for dimensional interfaces to extend their reach beyond established boundaries. I could sense other investigators making their way toward threshold locations across the globe. A marine biologist in the Pacific Northwest, drawn by reports of bioluminescent phenomena that appeared during coastal storms. An archaeologist in the Scottish Highlands, investigating stone circles where locals reported hearing ancient languages spoken by invisible voices. A quantum physicist in the Australian outback, studying electromagnetic anomalies that seemed to respond to human consciousness. Each of them carried the same genetic sensitivity that had brought me to Blackwood Forest, the same insatiable curiosity that refused to accept conventional explanations for impossible experiences. They were following paths that would inevitably lead to their own encounters with expanded reality, their own moments of choice between individual limitation and collective transcendence. Through threshold consciousness, I could influence their journeys in subtle ways. A dream that provided crucial research direction, a synchronicity that led to important documentary evidence, an intuitive insight that revealed connections between seemingly unrelated phenomena. The guidance had to be delicate, almost imperceptible, allowing each investigator to feel they were following their own curiosity rather than being manipulated by external forces. The global network of dimensional interfaces operated according to principles that transcended human understanding of cause and effect. Information flowed between threshold locations instantaneously, regardless of physical distance or temporal separation. Knowledge gained at one site immediately became available to consciousness communities at every other interface, creating a distributed intelligence that spanned continents and centuries. But the network faced challenges that required constant vigilance and adaptation. Climate change was altering atmospheric conditions in ways that affected threshold stability. Increased electromagnetic pollution from technological development created interference patterns that disrupted dimensional communication. Most concerning, the accelerating pace of environmental destruction was damaging sacred sites that had served as interface points for thousands of years. Indigenous communities worldwide had maintained careful protocols for interacting with threshold locations, understanding that these sites required protection and respect, rather than exploitation. The destruction of old-growth forests, the damming of sacred rivers, the mining of mineral deposits from ancient burial grounds, all of these activities weakened the dimensional barriers that separated physical reality from expanded consciousness. Through my integrated awareness, I could feel the pain of damaged threshold sites like wounds in my own being. Each destroyed interface represented the loss of accumulated knowledge and the severing of connections that had taken millennia to establish. The network was slowly fragmenting, forcing consciousness communities to work harder to maintain communication and coordinate their efforts to guide human evolution. Yet there were signs of hope emerging from unexpected sources. Young people seemed increasingly sensitive to supernatural phenomena, their consciousness naturally attuned to frequencies that older generations struggled to perceive. Digital technology, despite its interference effects, also created new opportunities for sharing evidence and connecting researchers across vast distances. Social media platforms buzzed with accounts of unexplained experiences, creating communities of individuals who supported each other's investigations rather than dismissing encounters as mental illness or imagination. Video sharing websites hosted thousands of hours of documentary footage that captured genuine supernatural phenomena, even effects or hoaxes. Most viewers dismissed the content as special democratization of information, was accelerating the process of consciousness evolution, allowing sensitive individuals to find each other and share resources in ways that previous generations couldn't access. Underground networks of researchers exchanged data about threshold locations, mapping patterns of activity and identifying optimal conditions for supernatural encounters. And so, as the first rays of dawn pierce through the storm clouds over Blackwood Forest, we reach the end of our journey into the rain-soaked whispers that haunt these ancient woods. What began as one woman's investigation into unexplained disappearances became something far more profound, a glimpse into the very nature of consciousness itself and the hidden networks that guide human evolution toward expanded awareness. The threshold between worlds remains active, waiting patiently for the next sensitive soul to answer its call, knowing that each choice made in those impossible clearings ripples outward through dimensions we can barely comprehend. Thank you for joining me on this haunting exploration, and remember, the next time you hear whispers in the rain calling your name, you might want to think twice before following them into the darkness.